700 GMT, March 11, 2024. Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump talking tough against each other regarding the election 2024 in November. Mr. Biden regrets the Israeli decision regarding Rafah, Gaza. Photos of Kate Middleton. Heavy storm with strong winds in the United States eastern coast, especially New York. Car causing too much problem. Israel continue bombing Gaza despite of starting of Ramadan. Saddam Hussein saga. Frozen embryo are living thing. Heavy flooding in Indonesia. Chaos in Haiti. Evacuation of American personnel. I am thankful to all news resources. Now the news in detail.
Tonight on PBS News Weekend, ahead of tonight's 96th Annual Academy Awards, the role and recognition of women both in front of and behind the camera. Then, a new book re-examines the relationship between Saddam Hussein and the U.S. across 4 administrations.
Saddam's contribution to the origins of the war has been missing from our own reckoning, and for once, we have the opportunity with these new materials to really expand our sense of where this tragedy came from.
And what's behind the recent push for legislation that gives fetuses the legal rights of a person.
Major funding for PBS News Weekend has been provided by
Consumer Cellular. This is Sam. How may I help you? This is a pocket dial. Well, somebody's pocket.
Thought I'd let you know that with Consumer Cellular,
You get nationwide coverage with no contract. That's kind of our thing.
have a nice day.
and with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. And friends of the News Hour. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Laura Barone-Lopez. John Yang is away. Today, talks aimed at securing a 6-week ceasefire in Gaza remain stalled as efforts to increase aid deliveries by sea moved ahead at a crawling pace. A U.S. Army ship full of equipment to build a temporary pier off Gaza's coast for delivering aid is en route to the Mediterranean. Construction of the pier is expected to take weeks. Another ship full of aid is still waiting in Cyprus. As the civilian death toll in Gaza climbs, President Biden stepped up his public criticism of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in an interview on MSNBC.
He must pay more attention to the innocent lives being lost as a consequence of the actions taken. He's hurting, in my view, he's hurting Israel more than helping Israel by making the rest of the world, it's contrary to what Israel stands for.
Biden also said an Israeli military operation into the southern city of Rafah would cross a red line, but added that the U.S. would continue sending weapons shipments to Israel. Alabama Senator Katie Britt responded to criticisms today about a misleading story she told in her Republican response to President Biden's State of the Union address. In criticizing Biden's border policies, Britt talked about meeting a woman who had been sex trafficked at age 12. In reality, the trafficking occurred outside of the U.S. decades ago. Britt appeared on Fox News Sunday.
To be clear, the story that you relate is not something that's happened under the Biden administration. That particular person.
Well, I very clearly said I spoke to a woman who told me about when she was trafficked when she was 12. So I didn't say a teenager. I didn't say a young woman, a grown woman, a woman when she was trafficked when she was 12.
Senator Britt's office confirmed on Saturday that she was speaking about a woman who had been sexually abused in Mexico from 2004 to 2008. And in Haiti, the U.S. military airlifted non-essential embassy personnel out of the capital Port-au-Prince overnight and added U.S. forces to bolster security as escalating gang violence threatens to bring down the government. The Caribbean nation is under a state of emergency. Thousands of Haitians have been forced from their homes in the unrest, and efforts to assemble a foreign armed force to aid Haitian police have been unsuccessful so far. Still to come on PBS News Weekend, a new examination of the relationship between the U.S. and Saddam Hussein, and the conservative push to give fetuses legal rights.
This is PBS News Weekend from WETA Studios in Washington, home of the PBS News Hour, weeknights on PBS.
Tonight's 96th Academy Awards will honor the most acclaimed films of 2023, a year that could be considered a milestone for women in film. Women filmmakers set a record in the Best Picture category, including Greta Gerwig's Barbie, which is the highest-grossing film ever directed by a woman. But the past year, punctuated by months of strikes in Hollywood, also highlighted the ongoing struggles in diversity, equal pay, and equal opportunities for women. Rebecca Sun is senior editor of diversity and inclusion for The Hollywood Reporter. Rebecca, this year, a record-breaking 3 films directed by women are nominated for Best Picture. Is this a sign of progress or an outlier?
I think it's a sign of progress, but with a huge caveat. It is a sign of progress that people are recognizing movies directed by women as worthy of Best Picture nominations. However, it must be noted that only one of those women was nominated herself for Best Director. And so that's where the big caveat comes in. People are loving the overall result and not really giving credit to the person who is most responsible for that success.
Speaking of these directors, last year, no female. We have one, Justine Triet, for directing Anatomy of a Fall. What does that say about the recognition of women in major roles in Hollywood?
I think what that says is that we have not yet reached a point of equilibrium or status quo. You're still dependent on that specific crop of films year to year. You're still dependent on a number of factors. We're not at a point where, just like with men, you can say, wow, this year, 4 or 5 men were nominated for director. You don't say things like that because it's sort of a given. We're still seeing that this is vastly the exception and not the rule.
A recent report out of UCLA found that films with diverse casts received the highest median global box office earnings across last year's top films, and audiences of color flocked to opening weekends for 14 out of the top 20 films. Is Hollywood responding to this in any way?
Not in a way that is commensurate to what we're seeing. It's been known for years and years that movie-going audiences, in other words, the American population, is growing more racially diverse. And yet I do think that conventional wisdom in Hollywood, the decisions made by those who are at the very top, they still are thinking of white audiences as sort of the norm, and that anything that appeals to everybody else as niche. And so whenever they make a film that's quote-unquote targeted towards quote-unquote diverse audiences, that is seen as a niche film and not a wide four-quadrant release. So there is still quite a ways to go despite what the audiences are saying.
Films like Barbie and The Little Mermaid, which both had female leads, were among the top 10 highest grossing films last year. But does that mean that that type of success actually translates into more opportunities for women?
I think it has the potential to translate, but only if you're taking the correct takeaway messages. For example, when Barbie hit huge on opening weekend, there were a few think pieces initially that said, wow, this means that Hollywood should make more movies about toys, not more movies that are driven by and about women. And so it really, really does depend on, what you believe is the moral of the story. I mean, I think with Barbie and The Little Mermaid, are you just saying that I guess women are going to the movies now? Or are you saying, I guess everybody likes seeing movies about female characters? Those are two completely different takeaway statements.
What about unequal pay? Actress Taraji P. Henson, who's an Oscar-nominated film, The Color Purple, spoke out during the film's press tour about how women, and especially black women, are treated in Hollywood. And essentially, in Hollywood, women are paid fractions of what their male counterparts make. How pervasive is that problem?
That problem is as pervasive in Hollywood as it is in every other industry in this society. I think that the only difference is that the entertainment industry is a lot more visible. But still, what Taraji P. Henson is talking about, she's not comparing her salary to that of teachers who are chronically underpaid and part of a different conversation. She's talking about her salary compared to men who have had a commensurate level of experience and a commensurate level of accomplishment in the industry. When you look at that, the numbers do not lie. Women in Hollywood, including famous women in Hollywood, are still underpaid compared to men. And that is exacerbated even further when you're talking about women of color.
Before we let you go, were there any films this year directed by women, produced by women, or that had female leads that went under the radar but that are worth watching?
This is a tricky one because it's not exactly completely under the radar. Celine Song's Past Lives. She's a first-time filmmaker. She has an extensive playwriting background. It's just a subtle piece of work. It's really beautiful. It's a small, quiet movie. It has been nominated for Best Picture. It might take a while for people to discover, and so I hope they do sooner than later.
Rebecca Sun of The Hollywood Reporter, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Of Iraq was based on the allegation that the country's longtime dictator, Saddam Hussein, had weapons of mass destruction. The failure to find these weapons prompted intense scrutiny of the decision to go to war over 2 decades ago. In his new book, author Steve Call pored over hundreds of audio tapes and transcripts, many previously unreleased, of Saddam Hussein's internal meetings to uncover his view on the tumultuous relationship with the United States. Nick Schifrin recently sat down with Call.
The U.S. relationship with Saddam Hussein evolved dramatically across the decades, from the 1980s, when the U.S. aided his regime, to the 90s, when the U.S. sought to contain him and dismantle his program of weapons of mass destruction. And, of course, after 9/11, the U.S. invasion and his death in 2006. Using previously unreleased materials, The Achilles Trap, Saddam Hussein, the CIA, and the Origins of America's Invasion of Iraq, tells the story of how Saddam Hussein and 4 successive U.S. administrations repeatedly misinterpreted each other. The author is Steve Call. Steve Call, thank you very much. You write that this book, in part, is about the U.S. failure to comprehend Saddam Hussein, and you write that U.S. thinking was often wrong, distorted, and incomplete. How so?
Well, Saddam's motives confounded us. They also confounded many of his own generals and his neighbors, but he took actions that just didn't fit into Western logic and analysis. And so the U.S., particularly after the war to expel him from Kuwait, just assumed the worst. And in fact, he was making very complicated decisions on the basis of a calculation that we didn't really understand.
And that was mutual. You write how Saddam Hussein misinterpreted and had misaligned perceptions about what the CIA was doing. How so?
Well, he saw the CIA as omniscient, and he had long experience with their involvement in changes of government in Iraq, and he saw them around every corner and thought, for example, that they knew that he didn't have weapons of mass destruction. And so he interpreted the accusation that he did as just a game. And his comments to his comrades when he was talking to them in private was, there's no reason for us to play this game. We are not going to be rewarded by being honest or cooperative, so let's maintain our pride and defy them.
You document how the Reagan administration decided to help him, writing at one point that by 1983 it had lashed itself to an ambitious dictator. How did that effort go, and how did Saddam Hussein's own perception of U.S. assistance evolve?
Well, our objective was to help him avoid losing the war he had started with Iran, and we feared that he might, and that Ayatollah Khomeini would expand the Iranian revolution into Baghdad. So we started providing him with secret intelligence to give him a military advantage. He always regarded this help with suspicion, and he thought we were playing a double game, and we assured him for several years that he was wrong. And then in 1986, he wasn't wrong. And the Iran-Contra scandal demonstrated that, at least for a short time, the Reagan administration had played both sides. And there are these wonderful tapes after the scandal is revealed where he says to his comrades, I told you so. And what's important about it is that this conviction that there was a conspiracy between the United States, Israel, and Iran against him persisted well into the 90s. And so later, as he's talking to his colleagues about whether to cooperate, he refers back to Iran-Contra and says, just remember, what was revealed then remains the case now, and so we should be careful.
How did Saddam Hussein undergo what you describe as the, quote, stunning transformation from tenuous American ally to mortal enemy?
By invading and occupying Kuwait, an innocent neighbor with no defenses, that a country he decided essentially in the aftermath of his very expensive war with Iran that he needed Kuwait's wealth to reconstruct Iraq. And he ended up in a dispute with the Kuwaiti royal family and then decided basically to sack the country. Of course, George H.W. Bush organized an international military coalition to successfully expel him from Kuwait, but he survived in power, and that became the unfinished business of the 1990s that George W. Bush inherited on 9/11.
What did you discover about why Saddam Hussein essentially destroyed his weapons of mass destruction program after the Gulf War, but then was reluctant to allow UN weapons inspectors to be able to confirm that fact?
In the summer of 1991, he more or less secretly destroyed his chemical and biological stocks and the infrastructure of his nuclear weapons program. But then he failed to keep any records. He failed to tell the truth about what he had done. He lied about the history of the program, and he didn't really come clean for 4 or 5 years, creating the impression that he was hiding a secret weapons program. And that uncertainty persisted right through to the end. Why? Partly, I think he didn't want to appear weak in front of his enemies. He didn't want to appear weak in front of his own generals because he feared a coup attempt. He didn't want to be humiliated. And he also concluded that honesty wouldn't pay. And about this, he might be right, because as Madeleine Albright announced in 1997, the real underlying policy of the sanctions he was trying to escape was not just his disarmament, but his replacement.
The third era that you write about, of course, is after 9/11, and you point out in the days after 9/11, he made no attempt to separate himself from Osama bin Laden and said publicly the U.S., quote, is reaping the thorns its leaders have planted. Explain that.
He was oblivious to his own vulnerability after 9/11, and like a lot of people in the Arab world, he thought that the United States deserved a little bit of taste of the kind of rebound of its foreign policy. And so he became this kind of pundit in his meetings with his own cabinet and with visitors, continually talking about America's failures in the world and the consequences of 9/11. At the same time, he really was slow to pick up on the possibility that he would be targeted in retaliation for 9/11. He would say, of course, I had nothing to do with Osama bin Laden. I'm against Islamists of that type, but he didn't recognize that he was already in the crosshairs.
And finally, this is not about Ukraine, about the Middle East. It's a different topic than you've written about before. Why this topic? Why this book?
Well, I hope that enough time has passed that this momentous event in American post-Cold War life, the Iraq War, probably the biggest pivot point that we experienced as a nation after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that we could think in a different and larger way about its origins, because Saddam's contribution to the origins of the war has been missing from our own reckoning. And for once, we have the opportunity with these new materials to really expand our sense of where this tragedy came from.
The book is called The Achilles Trap, Saddam Hussein, the CIA, and the Origins of America's Invasion of Iraq. Steve Call, thank you very much.
Nick, great to be with you.
Last month, the all-Republican Alabama Supreme Court ruled that embryos created using in vitro fertilization are legally children and have what's known as personhood. The decision caused clinics across the state to halt all services, fearing potential prosecution for destroyed embryos. After weeks of backlash, Republican Alabama Governor Kay Ivey signed a bill on Wednesday that gives IVF providers and patients immunity from criminal charges. But the new legislation did not clarify whether frozen embryos will still have the same rights as people. Recently, John Yang spoke to Julie F.K., a human rights attorney who defends reproductive rights in cases around the world.
Julie, this ruling in Alabama was hailed by many in the anti-abortion movement, but then it was quickly followed by lawmakers in Alabama, many of them opponents of abortion, pressing for legislation that would protect in vitro fertilization from the effects of this ruling. What does that say about the approach or the attitude of the anti-abortion movement toward this issue?
Well, what it says is this is an election year, and they realize that an anti-abortion position is wildly unpopular with voters. About 70% of the country right now supports the Roe versus Wade framework, and as we've seen in individual lives, abortion is a key healthcare issue for many women and families. So some of these legislators are trying to kind of peel off who's deserving of reproductive health care by saying that IVF, yes, that's a good thing, but if you're going to make decisions about abortion or contraception or even miscarriage management, we're going to take that decision away from you and put it in the hands of anti-abortion folks and politicians.
To make sure everyone understands this issue, explain how fetal personhood affects in vitro fertilization and other reproductive health treatments.
Fetal personhood is kind of what we've seen in other countries such as Ireland that had a constitutional provision that equated the unborn with a mother or a pregnant person. And really what it does is try to hold a person's life at the same level as something that is either a fertilized egg or even before implantation and an embryo. And this is really about control. It's about who gets to decide whether, when, and with whom somebody gets to have a child or not. So what we're seeing here is really an attempt to broaden the anti-abortion position to control not just abortion, but also contraception, IVF, and a whole host of some of the most fundamental human rights decisions that women make.
These other states that we mentioned that have similar laws, do they have protections or carve-outs for IVF and other reproductive health issues?
The issue of whether IVF is banned or not is really new. It's not something that is that unexpected to those of us who have been working in the field for a long time, but it's kind of come upon us like gangbusters in the post-Roe landscape. And, how different states handle this, both in the legislative arena as well as what public officials are saying as far as aiding and abetting of abortion and criminalization, how women get treated in fertility clinics or in emergency rooms or in reproductive health care generally, is really unknown right now. What we are seeing is that more and more women are choosing to have medication abortions than ever before. Right now, that's the most popular method of abortion in this country, and telemedicine, virtual visits with your provider, are up to about 1/5 of the abortions in this country. So we're seeing this real uptick in people taking charge of their own medical decision-making and abortion rights through this new and safe method of abortion, at the same time as anti-abortion state officials are really expanding more and more every day what they're trying to do to control reproductive rights in this country.
When you talk about those efforts, you say this has come on like gangbusters since Roe was overturned. What do you think the effect is going to be in other states that tend to not favor abortion, to oppose abortion rights?
Well, I think we're going to see some copycats of anti-abortion politicians and state officials really fervently trying to either erase access to IVF, stem cell research, contraceptives, a whole host of things. Well, at the same time, the anti-abortion movement is split because some opponents of abortion wouldn't go that far, or if they would go that far, they're not going to do it in an election year. We've seen states trying to criminalize mifepristone, which is the abortion and miscarriage management medication, and overall it's become a political football because they don't have the majority of Americans who want to ban abortion rights, so they're doing what they can through conservative courts, through judicial maneuvers, and through messing with ballot initiatives to really take away the rights that people want.
Julie F.K., human rights attorney, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's our program for tonight. I'm Laura Barone-Lopez. For all of my colleagues, thanks for joining us.
Major funding for PBS News Weekend has been provided by
On this Sunday night, the start of a holy month marred by violence and despair. Ramadan begins with mounting fears in Gaza of an Israeli ground offensive, as logistical aid challenges leave millions in dire need and at risk of starvation. Canada's winter wallop.
We will see significant snowfall, which is driving the avalanche hazard.
Snow and rain ravage regions from BC to Quebec with more storms on the way. Remembering sacrifice and renewing bonds, Canada honors 10 years since its Afghanistan combat mission's end and the persisting ties. From the sugar shack to the red carpet, the Canadian sweetness to be savored at the Oscars tonight.
Global National with Farah Nasser, reporting tonight. You do gotcha.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. There are renewed fears of an imminent Israeli ground offensive in Rafah tonight as Ramadan begins. With no sign of a ceasefire in Gaza, Israelis and Palestinians are bracing for what could be a violent holy month ahead. Tonight, Palestinians in Gaza are preparing to mark Ramadan under the shadow of war and the backdrop of religious sites in ruins. And tensions are reverberating into the West Bank. In Jerusalem's Old City, tens of thousands are expected to visit the Al-Aqsa Mosque, a site that has long been a flashpoint between Israelis and Palestinians. Israel has limited access to the mosque since the Hamas attack on October 7th and is warning of further restrictions on worshippers. The United Nations says more than 500,000 Palestinians in Gaza are on the brink of famine. And with humanitarian aid slow to reach people, there is so much desperation during a time meant for prayer, peace, and reflection. Redmond Shannon has our top story tonight.
At a market in Rafah, there is some food available in the lead up to Ramadan, but not much. Look around, says this man. No one can afford to buy anything. He is among the hundreds of thousands of displaced people living in tents in Gaza's most southern city. Most adults will be fasting during daylight hours starting Monday. However, scarce food is in Rafah. In northern Gaza, the situation is even worse. The United Nations says airdrops are doing nowhere near enough to ease the food crisis. Hamas says at least 20 people have died of starvation. At a port in Cyprus, a Spanish aid ship was supposed to have left for Gaza this weekend. It remained in port Sunday night, but is expected to leave in the coming hours. Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly is on a visit to Israel. She says she wants Canada to be part of the coalition supporting the new maritime corridor. One of the NGO workers involved posted this video claiming it shows a jetty being built in Gaza. It's unclear if it's the same site as a US proposed temporary port. The US ship has now left Virginia with equipment for that project. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant inspected preparations for the sea corridor on Sunday, but cooperation between Israel and the US remains far from straightforward.
In my view, he's hurting Israel more than helping Israel.
US President Joe Biden talking about Benjamin Netanyahu's war strategy. The Israeli leader was quick to respond.
I don't know exactly what the president meant, but if he meant by that I'm pursuing private policies against the wish of the majority of Israelis, and that this is hurting the interests of Israel, then he's wrong on both counts.
The goal of peace before Ramadan has now been missed. Israel and Hamas continue to blame each other for the lack of any ceasefire agreement. Nitu?
Redmond Shannon in London tonight. Thanks, Redmond. Turning to the chaos and state of emergency in Haiti now. Last night, Washington sent in U.S. Marines airlifting non-essential embassy staff out of Haiti as violence engulfs the Caribbean country. Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, Bob Ray, will join Caribbean leaders in Jamaica for emergency talks on the escalating unrest tomorrow. Washington's pre-dawn operation in Haiti's capital appears to have been carried out by helicopter. Criminal gangs have effectively taken control of Haiti and have overrun the capital, Port-au-Prince, attacking the airport, police stations, prisons, and government buildings this week. The violence stems from attempts to overthrow the Prime Minister, Ariel Henry, who assumed power with U.S. support in 2021, but has not held an election. Global Affairs Canada says there are more than 2,900 Canadians registered as being in Haiti. Global Affairs also says the government is not planning any departure assistance or repatriation flights for Canadians in Haiti, but that it continues to monitor the situation closely. There is havoc in Indonesia tonight. Days of torrential rain has triggered flash flooding and landslides, killing at least 19 people. More than 70,000 people have been evacuated out of the province of West Sumatra, with at least 7 others still missing. Nearly 700 homes, as well as several schools, bridges, and 280 acres of farmland have been damaged. Officials are warning there could be further damage, with more rain expected in the days ahead. Here at home, much of Canada remains within winter's grip, despite most of the country springing forward for daylight saving time. Snow and rain has been slamming parts of British Columbia, Quebec, and along the East Coast this weekend. As Heather Urex West explains, there's still more wet, windy weather on the way.
Fredericton, New Brunswick was hit with heavy rain Sunday, with 45 millimeters expected to fall. A day after Newfoundland was hit with a blast of late winter snow.
In parts of Newfoundland, including St. John's, digging out with up to 50 centimeters of snow falling over the past 2 days. There is a brief break between systems. That'll be on Monday, but the winds will still pick up with gusts of up to 50 kilometers per hour. And for Monday night, we could see another round of snow.
There was heavy snowfall across much of Quebec this weekend, too. As much as 35 centimeters in places, knocking out power to more than 120,000 homes.
Right now, we have 215 teams spread across the most affected regions. Some secondary roads are hard to access, and our teams have to go and clear some broken branches under the heavy snow.
In Western Canada, an influx of rain and snow raising fears there could be snowslides. A special public avalanche warning remained in effect for the weekend for Banff, Yoho, and Kootenay National Parks, as well as Alberta's Kananaskis country. But the avalanche danger is highest right now on Vancouver Island, the Lower Mainland, as well as in northern BC, where an avalanche claimed the life of a snowmobiler earlier this year.
This is due to the incoming weather, so we are expecting a significant amount of precip and wind. Below the snow rain line, the precip will likely fall as rain, but above that we will see significant snowfall, which is driving the avalanche hazard.
Backcountry users being urged to check bulletins carefully. The final weeks of winter, on the calendar at least, packing a powerful punch. Heather Urex West, Global News, Calgary.
A ceremony was held at the National War Memorial in Ottawa this morning to mark the 10th anniversary of the end of Canada's combat mission in Afghanistan. More than 40,000 Canadian Armed Forces members served during the 13-year mission, and 158 of them died in the conflict. As David Aiken reports, though the combat mission has long been over, Canada remains very much connected to the troubled country.
It was Canada's longest war. Canadian men and women fighting and some dying from 2001 until 2014.
Our Afghanistan experience has left none untouched. Many, including families, are scarred physically, mentally, and morally from it.
Wayne Eyre is now Canada's top general, but he was a commander in the Afghanistan capital of Kabul on the day Canada's fighting there ended.
Many of us have asked and have been asked, what was it worth it? And the answer to that question is deeply personal.
I think it was very definitely worth it. I noticed my 2 tours, the difference.
What happened in Afghanistan in recent years doesn't change the nature of my service or my time or my experiences or those of my friends in Afghanistan. We were there, as General Eyre said, we were doing exactly what the country asked us to do.
Canada's fighting ended in 2014, but conflict in the country did not.
Our members served with valor and selflessness. They were there to make a difference, and they did.
Canada moved to providing Afghan governments with aid and advice. But since the Taliban takeover of the country in 2021, Canada has been trying to take in refugees. Ahmadallah Yaqubi was a civil servant forced to leave Afghanistan 3 years ago.
I don't have choice because Afghanistan for me was very difficult.
He had not seen his wife and 2 daughters since then, until their reunion last week in Calgary. They were part of a group of 300 new Afghan refugees.
In Afghanistan, daughter don't go to the school. Don't go now. My daughter coming here, go to school. My daughter, my family here is free, can go every place. But I'm very happy for that.
There are those who believe Canada can do more. There are Afghans, for example, who have had to flee the Taliban. They're in neighboring countries like Pakistan, hoping to get their chance to start a new life here in Canada. David Aiken, Global News, Ottawa.
In Oakville, Ontario, a long-standing monument at a private cemetery has been removed after much controversy over who it was honoring. The memorial was dedicated to a division of Ukrainian soldiers during the Second World War, but as Kayla McLean reports, those troops were part of a Nazi military unit.
In this Oakville cemetery, a monument once stood honoring World War II veterans. Under any other circumstance, it would never be questioned. But this monument honored soldiers that served on the wrong side of history.
To the Jewish people, this monument represents a horrible past. It connects us to the Holocaust.
The monument is dedicated to the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, a Nazi military unit made up of predominantly Ukrainian soldiers who fought with the Germans against the Soviet Union. The plot purchased by veterans of the division and erected in 1988.
They would have sworn allegiance to Adolf Hitler into the SS, and they would have participated consciously in actions that would have helped to facilitate the Holocaust.
Efforts to have the monument removed gained steam nearly 6 months ago when Yaroslav Hunka, veteran who served in the same division, received a standing ovation in the House of Commons, provoking international outrage.
In the fall after the Hunka affair, we saw a group of local neo-Nazis make a pilgrimage to this monument, which was deeply distressing.
But today, that pilgrimage site is gone. After years of lobbying and discussions held by Jewish organizations, the cemetery board, and local Ukrainian representatives, the decision was made to take the cenotaph down. And now, nothing but the platform and this sign remains. The cemetery's board says the sign will be removed Monday. Richard Robertson at Deny Breath Canada, who participated in the talk, says the work has only just begun.
It's incumbent that the removal of this monument be used as an example to further spur our government to continue to release information to the public about Canada's Nazi past so that we can learn from it.
This cenotaph didn't stand alone. There are other similar monuments to the SS unit that remain up in Edmonton. Monuments now whose days may also be numbered. Kayla McLean, Global News.
Nova Scotia's coastal controversy coming up, why a shift in the province's protection plan is stirring skepticism.
Whatever you do, it's better with a website. Introducing Hostinger Website Builder, the fast and easy web.
A recent reversal in Nova Scotia's strategy to address coastal erosion is generating plenty of criticism. As experts project the greatest rates of relative sea level rise will be along the Atlantic coast, some are questioning the provincial government's change of direction. Heidi Petrocic explains what they say is at stake. The seawall built at a small public beach on Nova Scotia's south shore has become a symbol of the struggle between private development and coastal protection.
We're very afraid of losing access, for one thing.
At high tide, the beach now disappears. Residents also worry the construction is damaging the dunes and the saltwater marsh behind.
If the Coastal Protection Act had been in place, that wall would probably not have been built.
That act passed in 2019 under the Liberals but was never proclaimed. So now the PC government has parked it, putting the responsibility for coastal development on municipalities and citizens instead.
It's very complicated for us at a provincial level to put in a set of regulations that deal with all of those various circumstances.
The province has created an online map to show coastal areas at risk. Experts say government isn't thinking long term.
When I've put in properties, there are some now, for example, that are not yet coastal properties, but will be by 2100. What are those homeowners supposed to do?
With at least 4.8 million Canadians living within 10 kilometers of the coastline, this is a very real issue for a lot of people, and nature isn't taking its time.
Coastal erosion processes in Atlantic Canada are particularly accelerating because of the lack of sea ice, as well as kind of increased storm surge and potential for hurricanes.
ACOM says Nova Scotia's strategy misses the mark, while Prince Edward Island, on the other hand, has a moratorium on most new coastal construction as it works out its own rules.
We need to be more thinking about retrieving or kind of retreating some of those properties at risk.
Back at Nova Scotia's Little Crescent Beach,
it's a middle finger to the people that live in this province.
Harsh words for the province's decision have government between a rock and a hard place. Heidi Petrocic, Global News, near West Dublin, Nova Scotia. Ahead, the warnings from experts as warm weather welcomes an early tick season. Spring is fast approaching, and with the change in season comes the risk of ticks and the disease they carry. And a mild winter means the arachnids may have gotten a bit of a jump in terms of reproduction and are already lurking in places you may not expect. Tonight, Catherine Ward looks at what you need to know.
You can't just wait till the spring feels like spring with crocuses to worry about ticks.
As people embrace this year's unseasonably warm weather, Associate Biology Professor David Beresford says it's crucial to remember ticks are also part of the package deal.
They only need about 40 degrees Celsius, and they're active and they're questing. They want to grab on and they want to bite.
This year, the National Veterinary Association says it is even more concerned than usual, saying recent research has shown that ticks infected with tick-borne pathogens may actually be more resilient than uninfected ticks, adding these fitter, better, faster, stronger ticks can increase the risk for people and pets across our country. Veterinarian Dr. Maggie Brown-Burry explains.
They are the first ones to kind of come to life when we hit that temperature that they need, and so they're the ones that are most likely going to be biting you, and that means increased risk of disease transmission.
In Canada, the ones to watch for are black-legged ticks, also known as deer ticks.
The tick will get onto you and you won't feel anything, and they're really good at being sneaky, and then they'll insert their mouth parts into you. They'll sort of cement them in.
Health Canada says a tick has to be attached for at least 24 hours in order to transmit the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. Experts say checking yourself after being outside is an easy and effective defense.
We need to get outside too, and it's not that hard to inspect. Just be aware of it. Remember, do it. It's a 10-minute operation.
Catherine Ward, Global News, Toronto.
Next, turning CRP setbacks into success. How a New Brunswick business is tapping into the season's early sap flow. Hollywood is gearing up for this year's Academy Awards tonight, with Christopher Nolan's historic epic Oppenheimer heavily favored to take the top Oscars, including Best Picture. Plenty of Canadian talent will also be in the spotlight. That includes Celine Song and her acclaimed debut film Past Lives, nominated for Best Picture and Best Original Screenplay. And Ryan Gosling up for Best Supporting Actor for his show-stealing performance in Barbie. Win or lose, Oscar hopefuls will be able to enjoy a Canadian treat for their taste buds afterwards. Sagar, a luxury suite from Quebec, will be part of the very expensive gift bags being given to the stars at tonight's ceremony. The treat is made from fluffy sugar from maple sap and is said to be worth $1,300. There is plenty of maple sap to go around for some businesses in New Brunswick, but due to bad weather conditions, last season was not ideal for our prize syrup makers. But now, as Anna Mandan tells us, an early start to the sap flow is already sweetening production.
Dumfries Maples collects and prepares its own maple sap, which is turned into products like syrup and maple butter. This year, the sap flowed early.
Still hopeful that, it may just work out to be an average season or maybe a little better. We'll wait and see.
They've started producing syrup a week ahead from last year. They're not the only ones.
It is definitely an early season. Late season, we don't get maple sap until the end of March or early April.
This year's early start means Little Mactaquac Maples can run tours during March break.
It's nice to be able to get everybody out and get started early in the season.
But both producers were very clear. An early start does not mean a good season.
We can't make predictions until it's over because really we have no control over the weather, and that's really what does it for us.
Last year was a bad season for maple syrup. Scott says their production was down about 30%.
You don't like to have too many of those in a row because you do have to make product.
For the sap to keep flowing, producers need consistent freezing overnight and warm temperatures during the day. That gets the sap from the tree to processing equipment and onto pancakes. Cheryl Jones just had some of the Dumfries maple syrup.
I had it for brunch. It was delicious.
The season will end around mid-April to May. Producers will know then whether it was a good year for maple syrup. Anna Mandan, Global News, Dumfries, New Brunswick.
And that is Global National for this Sunday night. I'm Neetu Garcha. We leave you tonight in the Middle East, where officials have...
A charity ship remains docked in Cyprus after it was expected to leave for Gaza on Sunday. It's to transport some 200 tons of food to desperate civilians as the Muslim holy month of Ramadan begins with hopes of a truce all but over. Portugal's centre-right Democratic Alliance claims victory in parliamentary elections. Party leader Luis Montenegro hailed the win as inevitable, but he is short of a majority. He reiterated, however, that he would not form an alliance with the far-right Chega party, which fared very strongly. And Oppenheimer sweeps the Academy Awards, winning 7 Oscars, including Best Film, Best Director for Christopher Nolan and Cillian Murphy with Best Actor. Other big winners, the Frankenstein-esque Poor Things, including Best Actress for Emma Stone, and the French film Anatomy of a Fall. Very good evening to you. Thanks for joining us here on France 24. A charity ship docked in Cyprus is still waiting to depart for Gaza, transporting desperately needed humanitarian aid. The Spanish vessel Open Arms is to pull a barge with some 200 tons of food aid to desperate civilians facing the threat of famine after 5 months of war. Israel has welcomed the deliveries, saying it will inspect all cargo before it enters Gaza. The UN, however, says sea deliveries and also airdrops, which have recently been stepped up, are woefully insignificant to meet the needs of Gaza's population. Well, the Muslim fasting month of Ramadan is to begin in the coming hours with sunrise, with the hopes of a truce in Gaza all but gone. On Sunday, mediators in Cairo sought to restart negotiations between Israel and Hamas, but to no avail. It comes as Israel remains set on launching a ground invasion of the southernmost city of Rafah, where over 1 million Palestinians have fled after 5 months of war. Eliza Herbert tells us more.
As the sun set over Rafah, so too dimmed the last glimmers of hope for a ceasefire before Ramadan. Israel and Hamas continued the blame game on Sunday, with Hamas saying that Israel hasn't committed to clear guarantees.
We did not receive any commitment from the enemy regarding a ceasefire. This means they want their prisoners to return and then resume the war on our people and our enclave.
The Hamas leader doubled down on the group's key conditions, which include a total ceasefire and end to the war, as well as the withdrawal of all Israeli troops from Gaza, the return of displaced people to their homes, and humanitarian and reconstruction aid. Mediators in Egypt are now pushing for a truce during Ramadan, which begins on Monday or Tuesday, with fears growing that the violence could spread if fighting continues, particularly in East Jerusalem, where tensions are likely to flare over access to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Israel representatives say they will allow freedom of worship at holy sites.
Our war is not against Islam, but against those who hurt Islamic values, against those who commit crimes against humanity, and who sought to tear apart Israeli society and our common future. Hamas murderers today also want to see the month of Ramadan turning from a month of prayer to a month of bloodshed.
Meanwhile, in the US, President Joe Biden has said no fighting should be happening during Ramadan, and that Prime Minister Netanyahu needs to pay more attention to the innocent lives being lost.
Portugal's centre-right Democratic Alliance has claimed victory in Sunday's tight parliamentary election. Leader Luis Montenegro said the Portuguese had voted for change, but his party has little chance of forming a majority government. Emerging as a potential kingmaker, however, is the far-right populist party Chega, which fared much better than expected. Montenegro reiterated he would not form an alliance with the far-right. Nick Rushworth tells us more.
As the election evening unfolded after Portugal's snap election on Sunday, it looked like the centre-right Democratic Alliance had clinched a clear win, though not an outright majority. The Democratic Alliance leader Luis Montenegro, however, turned out to be neck and neck with the ruling socialist led by Pedro Nuno Santos. Santos conceded defeat in the early hours. The party in third place, Andre Ventura's far-right party Chega, which means enough in English, surged in strength. It was the big winner on the night, emerging as a strong force in Parliament, almost tripling its vote on the last election in 2022.
This marks the end of the two-party system, and it also means there will be a strong right-wing majority to govern. It means that from tonight, we have to begin work so that there is a stable government in Portugal.
Ventura is a former trainee priest who went on to become a football commentator. He campaigned on tougher measures to fight corruption and stricter controls on immigration, as well as chemical castration for certain sex offenders. His party's increased support confirms that the far right is on the rise across Europe, with 3 months to go before the European elections. Luis Montenegro, after the vote, reiterated that he ruled out any deal with Chega. That means more instability for Portugal. It will be difficult for his democratic alliance to govern. This is Portugal's second election in 2 years. It was called after Socialist Prime Minister Antonio Costa resigned last November after 8 years in power amid a corruption investigation involving his chief of staff.
And finally, Oppenheimer has swept the Academy Awards, winning 7 Oscars, including Best Film, Best Director for Christopher Nolan and Best Actor for Cillian Murphy. The Frankenstein-esque Poor Things took 4 Oscars, including Best Actress for Emma Stone, and the French film Anatomy of a Fall winning Best Original Screenplay. Well, to take us through all the highlights, France 24's Wassim Conley is at the Dolby Theatre on Hollywood Boulevard, and he joins us now. Wassim, great to talk to you. Talk us through the key moments of this, the biggest of nights in Hollywood.
Yeah, James, it was certainly Oppenheimer's night. 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. A very similar run to last year's big winner, Everything Everywhere All at Once. The way the winner was announced, though, was very anticlimactic, with director Al Pacino catching the audience off guard by giving the result almost mid-sentence. But anyway, it was a slow start for the summer blockbuster. It lost several Oscars to some of its main rivals, including Poor Things, but it managed to come out on top toward the end of the ceremony, with Cillian Murphy winning the Oscar for Best Actor, his first Academy Award.
I'm afraid we appear to have lost the connection to Wassim Conley there in Los Angeles. We will try and get him back throughout the program. And a reminder, of course, that Oppenheimer has swept the Academy Awards, winning 7 Oscars, and Poor Things taking 4 Oscars, including Best Actress for Emma Stone as well. We'll be back throughout the morning with more updates on the Academy Awards. Please stay with us here on France 24.
It remains the deadliest terrorist attack on European soil this century. On the 11th of March 2004, a series of 10 coordinated explosions within minutes of each other.
A Ramadan in Gaza like no other, as Israel continues to bomb and starve civilians to death during the Muslim. A Ramadan in Gaza like no other, as Israel continues to bomb and starve civilians to death during the Muslim holy month. Hello, I'm Funi Batibo. You're watching Al Jazeera live from Doha. Also coming up, the Israeli army says it's investigating the killing of a disabled and unarmed Palestinian man in Gaza after a soldier's body cam video shows him bragging about the shooting. An Al Jazeera investigation finds that some Israeli citizens were almost certainly killed by Israeli helicopters during their chaotic response to the October 7th attacks. And Portugal swings right in general elections as the governing socialists concede defeat, but the centre-right falls short of a majority. As Ramadan begins, Muslims around the world are dedicating prayers to the 2.3 million people starving and under attack in Gaza. Israeli forces have now killed more than 31,000 people in a campaign described by the International Court of Justice as a plausible genocide. Among the latest to be killed were 16 people in southern Gaza, but 8 Palestinians were killed sheltering in a tent in Khan Yunis. Those that survived the airstrikes are facing extreme hunger. The number of people who starved to death has risen to 25. The United Nations says the situation is rapidly deteriorating and the number of deaths could rise quickly in the next few days. Overshadowed by Israel's war and hunger, Palestinians in Gaza will experience a Ramadan like no other. Julie Dager reports.
Ramadan is normally a time when Muslims come together to fast, worship, and reflect. But after 5 months of unimaginable violence, people here will instead have to endure the pain caused by Israel's relentless war on Gaza.
I came here to buy, but I can't find anything to buy. There's nothing. No dates or milk or anything. One can't find anything for their children. All these canned goods are full of germs that infect the stomach. We need vegetables and fruits to feed our children because they've weakened and died from hunger.
More than 2 million people are being forced to live with little to no water or food. Israel is refusing to let enough aid in. The supplies that do exist are unaffordable. The holy month has added meaning here.
I think this Ramadan will add to the tragedies of the Palestinian people. A new tragedy and a new torment. The situation is very difficult, and any person who says that they can endure the pain of this month, financially, spiritually, mentally, look over all of this market in vain. No one can afford to buy anything.
Every single person in Gaza has lost a loved one or knows someone who has. And friends and families are torn apart, unable to celebrate together.
This year's Ramadan is different from previous years. First of all, we are far away from our loved ones, our families, relatives and friends in the north. Everything is different.
Israel's indiscriminate attacks have destroyed or damaged at least 184 mosques in Gaza. But faith is undiminished across the strip, and Palestinians say they'll keep praying for the war to end. Julie Dager, Al Jazeera.
In occupied East Jerusalem, Israeli forces have blocked the entrance to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. Some worshippers prayed outside. Others who were trying to enter the compound were beaten by Israeli soldiers at the gate entrance. The Al-Aqsa compound is the third holiest site for Muslims. Since October the 7th, Israeli authorities have limited the number of people allowed in. Now, many Palestinians in occupied East Jerusalem fear Israeli restrictions will further ignite the conflict. Undersal Holt reports.
Preparations are underway for the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. In occupied East Jerusalem, Palestinians are making arrangements for their annual fast, but this year with even more hardship.
The situation is getting worse. Each time it gets worse. God willing, Ramadan will pass without issues, come without restrictions. Of course it is getting worse. Us here in Jerusalem, we don't know what's coming.
But fears of escalation in the conflict aren't the only thing on the minds of these Palestinians.
These alleyways in the Old City are typically filled with festive lights, but this year celebrations are muted in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza, who are still under relentless Israeli attack.
And the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Islam's third holiest site and the focal flashpoint during the Muslim holy month, often plagued by Israeli restrictions and violence against Palestinians. Muslims fear Israeli forces will prevent them from attending Friday prayers and nightly Tarawih prayers, services that are only held during Ramadan, when hundreds of thousands of Muslims normally attend.
If there are restrictions, there will be a lot of problems. I'm sure of this. If someone like me is prevented from praying, this is something that won't be acceptable. At the very least, this is our right to pray here, and they are preventing us.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel won't restrict the amount of worshippers at Al-Aqsa for the first week, but that decision could change based on a weekly assessment. In previous years, Israeli forces have stormed the compound and attacked Palestinians, sometimes forcibly removing them to make way for visits by Jewish ultranationalists who seek to change the status quo that states prayers at the site are exclusive to Muslims. And this year, overshadowed by the war on Gaza, Palestinians are prepared for yet another Ramadan under occupation. Hamdas Al-Hout, Al Jazeera, occupied East Jerusalem.
Let's now speak to Hatem Bazian, who's lecturer in Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures at the University of California, Berkeley, and author of Palestine, It Is Something Colonial. Thank you very much for joining us on Al Jazeera, Mr. Hatem. So the world is seeing probably more conflicts than ever before, from Sudan to Gaza, of course. What does Ramadan mean this year in the face of all this global uncertainty and conflict?
For the American Muslim community that has been mobilizing for the past 5 months, focusing on Gaza, but also keeping an eye on Sudan and expressing solidarity and sympathy, we feel that a sense of trauma. Most of the community is mobilizing for humanitarian relief, for medical projects, but also trying to put pressure on the Biden administration, on the American political leadership that continue to give Israel literally open hand without any red line or limits. So this is really a traumatic period, even though that people want to spend Ramadan to fast, to reflect, to recite the Quran and open the mosque for services. But definitely it is a very, very traumatic period for the American Muslim community.
Indeed, we've seen American Muslims, those in the state of Michigan, for example, express dissatisfaction with the Biden administration in the way it's handled the war on Gaza. What is Ramadan going to be like? You know, in the past, we've seen the White House extend invitations to Muslims during the holy month of Ramadan. What is it going to be like this year?
Well, I know for a fact from my communication and discussions with the broader Muslim leadership in the United States that we're asking that mosques should not welcome politicians who have not expressed a demand or a call for immediate ceasefire, and anyone that continue to support Israel unconditionally by using this euphemism of Israel having the right to defend itself. We're saying that such political figures are not welcome in the mosques. We're also, if the Biden administration or the State Department or any of the major institutions are going to hold these annual iftars, we're actually calling for people that not to attend and not to show up, because we're not for breaking the fast at a table that simultaneously continue to send Israel bombs. So we're not interested in a public relations photo op iftars, whether at the White House or the State Department. We could do without. What we're asking the United States to say immediate ceasefire and ending U.S. military aid to Israel immediately.
Just looking at the situation in Gaza more closely, Mr. Hatem, Israel has stopped pretty much most humanitarian aid deliveries. There is starvation, famine in the north, and people today will have to make a choice between feeding their starving families or fasting. Just help us understand, for our international audience perhaps, what religion says about fasting in times of conflict or hardship.
Well, Islamic law provides the dispensation, or what we say rukhsa, that in times of hardship you could break your fast. But in here, people want to express their spiritual devotion. They want to fast. But simultaneously, Israel is having literally a genocidal policy by intentionally preventing food, supplies, milk, medicine, basic necessities of life to go to Gaza. So we're having 2.3 million people literally starving in front of our eyes. I would not be a person to say to Gaza that you should have an obligation right now to fast, but I know people will fast, considering the hardship that they're under. And we call for the United Nations, for the OIC, for all international community agencies to demand the opening of the borders. The supplies that we see, almost 2,000 trucks lining up on the Egyptian side of the border that have not been able to cross, the various crossings from Israel where settlers are blocking the road for these supplies to come in. This is a preventable genocide, if there's such a notion of preventable genocide. A hunger that is in front of us, and literally the international community is being impotent from coming to the aid of the Palestinians for no other reason than they are Palestinians.
Thank you so much for talking to us. Hatem Bazian, lecturer in Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures at the University of California, Berkeley. We appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The Israeli army says it's investigating the killing of an unarmed, elderly and disabled Palestinian man during a raid on a refugee camp. It follows a broadcasting of body camera video showing an Israeli soldier killing the man in Gaza City in November and then bragging about it. The Israeli army says weapons were found and the man was shot as he moved towards.
Thank you for watching and privilege of your time. This is Amir Shakil 5858. I am Amir Woodman. Have a good life.